Hello everyone, my name is Dean and welcome back to the 20 and 20 Challenge. This is week 14 of the Ruby on Rails series where I help you become a better developer by presenting these small projects on a weekly basis. Of course, I'm not always releasing these videos on a weekly basis, but hopefully you're watching them on a weekly basis. Today we're going to be taking a look at some unit testing strategies using RSpec. Now RSpec is a behavior-driven development testing suite. And behavior-driven development is a subset of the test-driven development methodology, which means you're writing these tests before you're writing these features. Now I'm going to be doing a bit backwards today. I'm going to be generating some of the tests before I have the features, and that's just because I want to show you how you can integrate RSpec with your scaffolds, and then you should intuitively be able to understand how you take that a step further to write your own tests for features that branch off of what the scaffold or the generators can provide for you. In this same vein, I'll be showing you how to test a helper method, which is sort of disconnected from the MVC paradigm that we're used to, and then hopefully you can apply that generic strategy into testing anything inside of your Rails application using RSpec. Now, of course, RSpec is not a complete integration testing suite. You will have to test some other aspects of your application. You want to be able to say, does my business logic and do my business values persist from the back end to the front end and provide the customer with the experience they expect? With that in mind, I'd just like to mention that there is also another set of tools in the sense of Capybara, which will allow you for some more in-depth testing. And Capybara is meant to be paired with RSpec. It's not a replacement. So you will be using one with the other. So if that's something you're interested in, I'd suggest taking a look at some Capybara tutorials after you're done with this one to sort of get the full testing suite experience. And then hopefully with something like Factory Girl or one of the other factorization gems, you can have an entire testing strategy to thoroughly vet your application before you even release it to whoever is testing it, whether that's your inside test team or whether that's just your users that you've promised as a Patreon perk to allow in early access. Now, on the note of Patreon, I just want to say, if you have any questions about test-driven development or any of the things we talk about today, there is a Discord channel, which isn't why the Patreon's being mentioned, but there is a Discord channel. I have a link down in the description and in the pinned comment. You can join there, ask any questions you would like, and some of the people in that channel, the patrons that support this channel, will probably get to you sooner than I will possibly be able to. Shout out to Woods. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure to check the Discord. It's totally free. You do get some perks if you are a Patreon subscriber, in the sense you get like custom roles or whatever. But the main purpose of this pitch is just join the Discord. There's a bunch of wonderful people who will help you with any of the problems you run into. And honestly, the customer support there is something to marvel at. So that does it for me. Let's go ahead and let's jump into some code where we create our scaffold app first, and then we'll take a look at how to actually test it with RSpec. Okay, so for this, the first thing we're going to be doing is generating a new Rails app, and we're going to exclude the tests that it normally creates for us by default. And for this, I'm going to be referencing the blog post over on Deanin.com. This is a demo version of it, or I guess an unpublished version. But throughout the tutorial, I have this open on the other screen. So if you're wondering where I'm getting these commands from, you can just head over to Deanin.com. And I think this one should be like RSpec Rails or something as the URL. I'll have a link in the pinned comment for that. But for now, I'll just be referencing this. So what we're going to start with is a Rails new, I'll call this tested app, and then I'll just pass it the -t flag to say skip the tests. And then while that's generating, let's head over to railsbytes.com, and I'll zoom in a bit so you can see. And if you head over to railsbytes.com, you can scroll down and you'll see a whole bunch of helpful templates here. And this time the template we're after is going to be the RSpec one, but you can see there's also one for FactoryBot. And actually, there's probably one that combines RSpec, FactoryBot, and Capybara into one suite. But for this one, we're just going to grab the RSpec one. And then you can hit this copy to clipboard button to copy this to your clipboard. And we'll run this after this generator finishes creating the Rails app. All right, so now that the application's open and built, I'd like to start by grabbing this template and adding it to our application. Now, one thing I did notice is that running this template without having the RSpec gem added did cause some issues. So I would suggest taking a look at your gem file, and just making sure that maybe you manually add the RSpec gem, or just manually go through these steps if you need to. But I'm always one for adventure, so I'm going to go ahead and run this again and just see what this does. All right, so it looks like that ran successfully. I'm pretty sure I probably have the RSpec gem added locally or something. But if we look at our gem file, there is a group of development tests, so it looks like that worked as expected. The next thing I like to do is we'll just quickly add in Devise so that we have some user accounts that don't require a lot of setup. So for this, I'll just run the bundle command to install Devise. We can then say, let me also bump up the size of this console. We can then say Rails G Devise : install, which will install Devise, and then we can do a Rails G Devise user command to create our Devise users. Okay, so now that we have our user accounts and we have RSpec added to this application, inside of the spec folder, you can see that we have a spec helper, a Rails helper, and this models folder that has a user spec. You can see right here, there's a pending tag that says add some examples to or delete this file. Basically, if I were to cd into the spec folder and then run Rails spec, we would probably get, we'll probably have to migrate our database first. So let's do a Rails db : migrate Rails _env equals test. And then let's run the Rails spec command. And what we're expecting here is one example and one pending. And what this pending means is you just haven't implemented this yet. And you can see in your console when you run something that hasn't been implemented yet, you'll see pending, failures listed here are expected and do not affect your suite's status. So that basically just means, hey, you have these things that aren't being tested yet because we generated them for you, but we didn't really know how to test them. So here's just an empty file for you to include some tests in. So the best way to see like how to use some of these pending things is really just to go through. We'll create a small application real fast that just has some posts, and then we'll go through and we'll create some tests from scratch. So for this, I'm going to say Rails G scaffold posts. I'll give each post a title of type string, a body of type text, a user : references, and we'll give them a views of type integer. We can go ahead and run that scaffold generator. Then we can come over to our DB, migrate, and the second migration here, and we'll just set these views to default to 0. So now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and let's find our Rails DB migrate command for our test environment. Run the migration again. And now inside of spec, let's run Rails spec again and see if anything's changed. Now the first thing you can see here is that we now have 28 examples. We have some failing tests and we have some pending tests, or at least some more pending tests than we had previously. So what exactly is failing here? Well, the first thing to note is that views are going to increment when you visit a page, and a user isn't something you would set in a form. But by creating this as a reference, if we come up to our app, views, posts, form, you can see here that it's expecting you to just sort of enter a user ID or to enter the views for a post, which doesn't really make sense. So what we can do is we can delete these from our view, and then we can run our spec again. So now we don't have this bad code anymore, but you can see here, now instead of having 3 failures, we actually have 4 failures. And that's because we're over here changing code without updating our tests. Now, in a production environment, one of the things you'll run into is you'll change some code and something in a completely unrelated area of the application might break. For example, I might change this to say label text, or for the label body in the text area, I might want this to be like just, text area. Or maybe I want this to say content. I do this, I save it, and I run this, and I'll have tests that are failing because it's like, hey man, I don't know what a content is, but we don't do that around here. And on my end, this seems like perfectly legitimate code. I assume that there's a thing called content that the controller accepts that gets added to the model. But the API team or the backend team is like, this should be named body. And when you have tests like this, they'll start to fail as soon as you change things. And you can fairly quickly evaluate like the depths of what your cost to implement this change is. So you change this, you see, there's 12 tests failing, and you see one of the tests is this really involved test, and you're like, okay, every time we have to change this test, it takes me at least an hour or two. So I know that this will probably take me 2 or 3 hours to fully implement this change. And that's sort of one of the safety nets that testing like this provides, is you can see how much you're affecting code that you might not necessarily touch in other aspects of the application, when in reality, like, it might not be obvious to you that maybe you aren't aware this is linked up. I mean, here it's just coming out of a controller, but you can imagine in a language like JavaScript where anything can be of any type and you're just passing around like this idea of variables, changing something can be a massive pain. But okay, so we update this field. We can then come into our controller. Okay, inside of our controller, we have a couple different things we can take a look at. Now, the first is the show action. Now, when you go to the show page, you would expect the views to increment. But of course, the views incrementing would just be at post.views equals at post.views plus 1, or you could do plus equals 1, or just do an update, and then at post.save. But let's assume that you have code like this, and then you want to test this. Now, I'm going to leave this code off for now. I'm going to let you implement this show method however you like. And then after you're done watching this video, I'd like you to have this show method and just go into your tests and see if you can figure out how to test this. Because I feel like this post view counter is probably a very simple example that you can test on your own to make sure that you understand the concepts of the video. But for now, I'll just go ahead and I'll remove this, and we can come down to our create method. Now, let's assume that whenever we get to the create page, we have a current user session. So we can say at post.user equals current user. Maybe instead of having, this, what we would want instead is a post helper to create, or to like declare the creator of this. So we could say, maybe we want something along the lines of, this is, I don't know, like assign post creator. And we want to pass in an at post and the current user, and we just want to get back a post, something like this. Why would you do this? Well, honestly, you really wouldn't under normal circumstances, because the other way is probably cleaner. But I'd like to show you how to use a helper and how to test a helper today. So we're going to just go ahead and we'll throw this into a posts helper, and then we'll have a include post helper up here, include posts helper up here, and then we'll call this method from our posts helper class. So if we come over to our helpers, posts helper, in here what we can do is we can say, all right, this is our posts helper, it needs a method, we'll def the method, and then we'll say this is the post, and we'll say this is the creator, just so it's a bit more clear. And we can say post.user equals creator. And then if we were to just return this, it would actually return the user. It wouldn't return the post. So then we can just say return the post. Of course, in Ruby, you don't need to say return post. You can just leave the post on its own line, and this will be returned on its own. So this is our helper method inside of our module, and we'll go about testing this in a little bit. But now we can come back to our post controller, and now our create logic is largely set up, but I would like to come down here, and inside of our parameters, I would like to get rid of the user ID in the views, because we've already decided these aren't things that are coming in as parameters. They'll be coming in other ways or set and assigned other ways. Next thing I'd like to do is come over to the models and the post.rb. And we have this belongs to user, but I'd also like to add some validation. So I want to say, validates the title. Say this has a presence of true, a length of a minimum of 2. We can say validates the body, presence, true, length is, let's say it's in 5 to 100. And then we can say validates the views, and we'll just want to validate the numericality of the views. So we'll say only integer true. Okay, so that gives us some basic validations. Then we want our user to say, you know, this user has many posts, dependent destroy. And we're just scaffolding out a basic application here, you know, nothing fancy. This is nothing we haven't done before. And then if we, you know, run a Rails, if we cd one level, run a Rails s command, we can then go to localhost port 3000, run our pending migrations for the development environment. And then we can say, let's go to /users/sign up. We'll pop over to sign up. We'll give this a dean@example.com with a password of password. Sign up. We're now signed in. Apparently I have compromised passwords. Password wasn't a good password. I'm shocked. And then we can come over to /posts. And you can see here we're signed in successfully. Let's also get rid of our style sheets scaffold. So we'll delete this as well. And then we'll say, okay, I want to create a new post. This has a title of this is a test post. Hello world. Create the post. Has a user assigned to it, has some views. Views are set to 0, of course. This isn't updating because I removed that snippet in the show method in our controller, but you get the basic idea. So this user is already being set. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's close this because now it's time to start actually testing our application. This functionality is great, but let's make sure that we're actually testing it. Now, of course, in the real world, it is encouraged that you write your tests first and then you implement the functionality. This is a bit backwards. We're not doing test-driven development here. This is more, you know, testing, developed, driven, something or other. But it helps to sort of understand how things work, and then afterwards, hopefully you can do some test-driven development by trying to implement this post views feature, because you've already seen how it will be implemented, so you can probably write your test first, and you'll be like, okay, I know it's going to vaguely look like this, and my post is going to have views incremented, so I'm going to write this test that asserts that the views are one higher than they were before, and then I'll go implement that functionality. But let's say we cd into our spec, and then we run a Rails spec command. The Rails spec command will tell us we still have 4 failures, 15 pending. Let's start by addressing the models. So we can come into our spec and our models, and we'll come into the post spec. And there's a couple things we can do in the post spec. So instead of having pending here, we can just remove this, and then we'll run this again, and you'll see this pending count go down to 14. But what we can say is, you know, that this maybe this post, it has a title, do, end, and this is basically your syntax for a test. It does some functionality in this block, right? So we can also say it has a body, do. And what else would we say that this post has? Well, we know that because we made these post validations, and I'm going to full screen this real quick, and I'll open up the post model again. We can move this over here just so we can see both of these, and maybe I'll zoom in a bit. We can see here it does have a title, but the title has a minimum title length. So maybe we want to say it has a title at least 2 characters long. And we can do a do block for that. And then we can also say, it has a body between 5 and 100 characters, do, end. And then finally we can say it has numerical views, do, end. So that's sort of testing our validations here. But how do we actually do this? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to say, let's create a current user object for this test. We're not going to have a session for this test, but what we can do is we can just create a user, and we can use the use this user as a means of testing that this functionality works. Remember, this functionality works assuming that the current user already exists when you get to this point. If you want to test whether the current user exists at this point, you would want to do a test versus your before action authenticate user in your controller. So let's say you come into your controllers, your post controller, and up here you do something like before action authenticate user, right? Say maybe you do this and you want to test it. That's the functionality you would want to test, and you'd want to make sure that the current user exists when you get to these pages. But right here, we're not testing that a current user exists. We're testing under the assumption that you have to have a current user when you get to this page, and another test will validate that a current user exists when you get to this page. So we're sort of separating our functionality and making sure that we're only testing one specific piece of functionality. So here, I just want to test that it has a title if I create a new post. So what I do is I say current user equals, and then we'll use user.find or create, and we'll give the user an email, and we'll say this is dean@example.com. We'll give it a password, and we'll say the password is just password, of course. And then we also need to give it a password confirmation. We'll say this is password as well. So that takes care of our password confirmation. I'll move this post over so we can see more. And then I'll save this file, run our formatter. So now we have our current user. So let's start by maybe trying to create a post. So we'll say post equals post.new. And then in here, we'll just, we'll give it a title. Title can just be the empty string. We'll give it a body. This can just be a valid body because, again, we're not testing that the body exists here or anything. This is just testing the title. And we can say this is also a user. So we'll say current user. And then it has views, which by default are set to 0, but we can also assign them to be something. And here we'll just assign them to be 0. So under these assumptions, this is an empty title. So we expect this test to fail. So we expect post to not be valid. And this is your exact syntax. So this right here you can think of as an assertion in JUnit Java or an assert in XUnit for C# or .NET. It's essentially the same thing. We're just expecting this post to not be valid because the title is empty, and we know that a title has, or a post has a title at least 2 characters long. So this post doesn't have a title that's at least 2 characters long, so we expect this to not be valid. But then if we say post.title equals has a title, now we should expect this post, to be underscore valid. So let's save this. Let's move this over here again, and then we'll go ahead and we'll run our Rails spec, and we'll see what happens to our specs. So you can see here, apparently find or create is not what this is called. I don't know why I said find or create. This should be first or create. And then we'll run our Rails spec again. You know, it doesn't help. You normally don't need tests for your tests, but in this case, probably should have them in all honesty, just because live demos are always like this. Here we can see that when we do the @post create in our post show method, we're running into issues because we don't have a current user like we do here. So that's something we'll have to clean up. We can see here that this assertion is wrong in this form stuff. A user needs to exist for the post index, and a user needs to exist for the edit. So that's all not great, but we are not getting any failures for this test. It's actually telling us that this test was fine. So let's keep going. Let's now say for our it has a body statement, we'll want to, again, create another empty post. This time we'll want it to have a valid title, and we'll give it an invalid body instead. And then we want this to be basically the same logic we had last time. So first we expect this to not be valid if the body is empty. And then we'll say post.body has a body. something like that. And then what we can do is we can say we expect this post to be valid now. And then let's come down to the next one. So here we say it has a title at least 2 characters long. Okay, well, same thing as before. We'll grab this post. We'll say this is our post right here. It should have at least 2 characters long. So if we just run our assertion on this again, we already know this is going to fail because we've already tested an empty title. In fact, what we could probably do is say, there's one test that says it has a title at least 2 characters long, and then it cannot have an empty title. And this would be our empty title test, and then we would just get rid of this. Because normally you want one test to test one piece of functionality, and here we're already breaking the rules by having 2 tests. So if you wanted to, you could abstract this out into a separate test, and then you could have 2 instead of this 1, and you would very quickly be able to identify when something broke. But okay, here we're saying, it has a title that's at least 2 characters long, so we expect this first one to not be valid because the title's empty. Let's then set the post title to be equal to 1, 2, and then we can say expect the post to be valid. And that'll handle our title issue there. Now let's come into our body. So here we need to test in a range. So again, we have a post that we're creating here, and it'll have a valid title, right? And then it'll have, this empty body. So again, we expect this body to not be valid. So we can say this is not valid. Then we want to say post.body equals, and we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 5 characters. Now we expect the post to be valid. And again, here we're going to break our rules a bit because we're testing multiple pieces of functionality here. This should probably be, if I wasn't doing a YouTube video, the way I would do this is I would say it has a body at least 5 characters long. And then I'd have another test that says it has a body at most 100 characters long. And then I would have a test that says, it cannot have an empty body. And maybe do some additional validations. It's always good to have negative tests, but normally you want one test to test one functionality. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the blog post because I guess we can just Google it. Let's look up a char string generator, maybe. Random string generator. Length should be 100 characters. We'll just say generate, and then we'll grab this. So this should be 100 characters. So after this, I want to say this is 100 char string, which is equal to this. And then we'll just move this back over here, and we can full screen this again. So this is a 100 character long string. Then we can say post.body equals 100 char string, and then we'll expect our post to still be valid, right? And then we can do one last test. We can say post.body equals 100 char string plus 1. And at this point, we expect the post to not be valid again. Okay, and then the final one we have here, we have this post views numericality one. And, we have a valid title, we have a valid body, and we want to test that our views are of type integer. So here we can say expect post.views.to space be a integer. And this is how you can test that it is of a certain type. So you have all of these matchers that you can use, and these are all available if you search online for, RSpec matchers, and they have a whole bunch of documentation on their website. You can also find, basically it's an industry standard to use RSpec. So, if you head over to rspec.info, they have a whole bunch of information. You can go to documentation, and you can sort of see how to use RSpec in the wild. But okay. let's say we're now done here. Let's move over and let's run our RSpec command and see how many things we broke. Well, we have 32 examples with 4 failures and 14 pending. So what we've managed to do here, and if I full screen this, is we've implemented a whole bunch of tests for our post, but that hasn't really helped with our errors or with our pending stuff. So here it looks like our views are the things that are failing. So what we can do is we can actually go to our views and we can just update these real quick. So if we go into spec, views, and let's just start with edit because it's the first one in the list, and I'll full screen this. We can see here that we're testing for user IDs and views. Well, the first thing I know is I don't expect these to be in the edit page. I expect them to be on the show page, but not in here. And what we need in here, our post spec at the top, we have this current user line. We can actually use that again here. And because I'm copying and pasting this code, you already know this should be abstracted into a test helper. But I'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer. If you want to do that, I'd suggest looking at how we did the post helper and seeing if you can create a helper file here and including it at the top in the same way and using the current user in there. But for the purposes of this, I'll just keep it in the same file. And then for this, we can say the user is the current user. Views will just set to 1. And then let's go ahead and let's save this and let's see if we manage to make anything better or worse. So we had 4 failures. Now it looks like we only have 3 failures. So that's definitely progress. Let's come over to our post index page now. And in here we can see we're setting 2 of these. Again, looks like we need a current user here. So let's grab our current user, create that in here. Let's change this so that both of these views aren't the same. So let's make this one 14, this one 12. Let's give this one a current user title and this one that. And, you know, we'll say this one, we expect the views to be to have 1 count. Actually, it's not for the views. What we want is this one. So this is our views. This should be 1. And this should be 14. And because we have 2 of these, we expect a second post to be on the page. And this one should be 12. And both of these have the same current user. Okay. But we do need to say current user.id toString. So what are we doing here? Basically, in our before statement, we're creating a couple posts. So here you can see we're creating 2 posts. We're giving each one a title, a body, a user, and views. Everything here is the same except for the views. So what this does is it says it renders a list of posts on the index page. That's true enough. It calls render, and then it asserts a select saying there's a TD that has the following text, which is title. This is the title right here. So there's 1, 2. It casts this to a string, and then it says there's 2 on the page. Well, there is. There's 1, 2 on the page. And that's the same for the body right here, my text, the user, or I guess the user ID. And if you actually look at the post index page, you can see here it's title, body, user, views, right? So that's basically what it's doing. It's just going through here. It's saying there's a TD that has these numbers in it. But let's go into our spec. Let's go into our index. Here we only have 114, which is coming from this post, and 112, which is coming from this post. So I guess my question to you is, how would you test if I said this one has hello world and this one has a body that says this is custom text? So how would you test these 2? So maybe take a moment and just see if you can get these tests to pass. And if you can, you know, let me know in the comments down below. And if you can't, feel free to leave a comment and I'll get back to you as soon as possible and try to help you figure out why this test isn't passing. But what we'll do now is I'll undo this, go back to what it was, and then I'll run my RSpec again and see how many things are broken. Okay, so now we're down to 2 failures. It's just the new page and the show page. So again, let's come over to the new page and let's see what's going on in here. Well, when I create a new post, I don't expect there to be a user ID or views, so we can just get rid of that. And we can again come over to here. We can grab this current user line,
And this is how you know something needs to be a helper, because you're creating it in so many different locations. But let's say, you know, we have this helper here. We then use this current user and set it up right here. And then let's go ahead and let's try to run this RSpec command again. Now we're down to one failure. Okay, so let's go over to our show page now, which is our final page that's failing. And what do we expect our show page to have? Well, once again, we expect it to have a current user block. And then we say this needs to have a current user. It has 0 views by default. And then let's say, well, we expect the render to match title. We expect it to match my text. Current user, it looks like it's just expecting nothing. Okay, sure. And then here we're expecting this one to be 0. So what could possibly go in this block with this current user? Well, if we look at our show page, so if we come up to here, come to the show page, for the current user, it's just printing out the user ID. So in this case, we could probably expect it to have a 1 because this will have the ID of 1. So let's go ahead and let's test this. And it looks like it's passing now. All we did here is we said the user has an ID of 1, so we expect a 1 to be on the page, and the views is 0, so we expect 0 to be on the page. And we now have no more failing tests. At this point, the only thing we can do is create some more tests. So what else can we test right now? Well, we've tested our views, we've tested our models, we have tests for our routes. So here in this routes, we can see there's a whole bunch of routes that we could test, but these are mostly already being tested. So Rails generates it. It says, you know, I expect the get/post route to contain post index, or to go to post index. We expect new to go to post new, but you can sort of follow this format for anything you'd like. There's really not a lot here to test. Now for requests, this is sort of where you can get a bit more fancy. So you have a list of valid attributes here, and we have a skip in here. So let's get rid of the skip. And then let's go ahead and let's grab our current user, paste it in here. Same thing we've been doing this whole time. And then let's create these valid attributes. The first thing we have an ID, which we'll set to 1. Oops, and then we do want to say let valid attributes do, and we want this to be its own little set here, and then afterwards we can say end, and we can tab these over. So give it an ID of 1, a title that we set to test, oops, and a body that we set to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this should look very familiar to the Rails params that you're used to. We can do the same thing down here. We can say, you know, do, or let invalid attributes do. And we come down here, and then down here we say end, and then we tab both of these over. So what's an invalid ID? Well, an invalid ID would just be something like A, because it's, you know, it's a self-incrementing integer. Title, what's invalid? Well, for this we can just say 1, because that's less than 2 characters. Body, what's invalid? Well, we can say 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, and then, you know, for views, you could imagine, because we're testing for an integer, what views and what user ID should be. But I'll leave that up to you. So if you want to create some invalid users and views, feel free to add them below this. Okay, now we have this get index here. Now, when we go to the get index action in the controller, it says it renders a successful response. So what does that mean? Well, instead of saying post.create and all this nonsense, let's just get rid of this real quick. And let's say post is equal to post.new. We'll pass in some valid attributes. And then we'll say, well, post.user is equal to the current user. We expect that. And then post.save. And then we want to say, okay, let's get the post URL. And then we expect the response to be successful, because it has valid attributes. It has an ID, a title, and a body. Views are automatically set, and we're setting the post user here. So we expect this right here to sort of pass the sniff test. Let's go ahead and let's save this, and then I'll come over here and I'll run another RSpec. And here it looks like we are failing all over the board. So why are we failing? Well, it looks like the reason why we're failing is because it's expecting a user to exist. So how do we fix this? Well, we can go through here, and for each of these, we can sort of update it. So we have the index. Let's also come into the show. So for a show, we again have a post new right here. And then we have post.user equals current user, post.save, and then we can say get post URL, and we expect that to be successful. And then for the new, we don't need to change anything here because the current user doesn't apply. For the edit, we can say, well, the post is equal to post.new again. So say post equals post.new with the valid attributes. Say post.user equals current user. And we can say post.save. And then we can check that the get edit is valid. Now down here we have some post create with a whole bunch of stuff. This is a bit more advanced than what we're planning on covering here. This is basically testing your delete functionality, testing your update functionality, testing your create functionality. So now what we can do, and I'm just going to remove these real quick so we can take a look at the ones that we've just created. So we have edit, new, show, index with valid and invalid attributes. We can now run another RSpec command, and we should see that we don't have these tests failing anymore. So what did I just remove from here? Well, this is quite a bit right here. Basically, you have some tests that say this tests, post creation, it tests post deletion, and it tests patching and updating. And for each of these, this is a bit more advanced, and this is something I'd hopefully cover in a more advanced testing tutorial. So for this section, for now, we're just going to leave this off. You are free, of course, to test this on your own. You can create a post and just test that it gets deleted. And alternatively, what you can do is you can just say up here, the post user is just the current user. Save that, and then run RSpec. And you should be down to 2 failures, and it's just creation that's failing now. It says post create with valid parameters. So what's wrong here? Well, we expect this to work, but post.count to have changed by 1, but instead it's changing by 0. So what we can do is we can come in here and we can say, well, okay, this is doing another post create. So instead of a post create, let's do this. So we'll come down here, and wherever we see a post create, we can say maybe, this one right here, this isn't a post create. We can do this one, post with the valid attributes. And then we can tab this over, we can tab this over, and then we can say invalid attributes. Well, for invalid attributes, whatever this is, nothing should happen. And then for the destroy, again, it's like, okay, well, let's create a post, and then let's try to delete the post. And then here it should redirect to the valid post. So let's try saving that, running another RSpec and seeing what happens. Looks like we still have 2 failures, and it's in the post create. So we now have everything set up except for this post create. So for this, what we should do is we should say, well, we want to create a new post. Let's say this is your post. We want to redirect to a post. Let's say this is your post. And then it does not have create a new post if it's not valid. So let's go ahead and let's try running this. Now we're down to just 1, which is post create with valid parameters redirects to the created post, which is line 85. Okay, so after a bit of testing around here, no pun intended, I managed to fix this issue. I'm not entirely sure why, but this test doesn't seem to like this redirect to. I might have to look into this more. If anyone knows why it doesn't like it, please, leave a comment down below. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this to be successful. So we just expect a patch request to be successful, which I feel like that's not really reaching too far. It's still doing the patch. It's just, it's not testing for the redirect. So that might be something to look into. But setting that aside, let's keep this party train going. The last thing I'd like to do now is I'd like to create a helper method to test the post helper. Now we do have some stuff inside of the user here, and the post patch and the post patch update. Both of these still need to be implemented. It looks like there's an empty hash here for the new attributes, so we can get rid of that. Or you can just create your own. And that should at least remove 2 of these pendings. This is, of course, throwing an error now. Oops. So we have, let me just full screen this. We have this new attributes, whatever is valid for this. Now this is basically what we had up here for this list of valid attributes. So we have this down here, I believe. So we can just do this. And that should hopefully cause this to pass. Looks like it's passing. A bit hacky. Now there's also some assertions that it's missing. But let's move on to the helper because we've spent enough time on this specific post spec. So inside of the post helper, it's looking for an example, or it's telling you, add an example here of testing a helper method. So for this, we'll test the helper method we created earlier inside of our helpers post helper, or we just assigned a post to user. So how do we test that? Well, this is a bit more traditional. We have just a function that takes in an input, returns an output, and we want to test that. Let's start by creating another user. So we'll come into here, we'll create a user. We'll just grab the one that we have in here. Oops. Grab this one, come into the post helper, paste it in. Instead of calling this current user, I'm going to call this creator just to have something a little bit different. And then I'm going to create an at post, and I'll say this is a post.new. This has a title that has the contents, my string maybe. It has a body that has the contents, my text, and it has views which are set to 1. There's our at post. Now in our controller, we call assign post creator. We pass in an at post and we pass in a creator, which is why we named these 2 variables the way we did. The name, of course, doesn't matter. And then we get this back, and whatever gets returned, we're like, okay, well, this is our, our returned post is equal to this. Or what we can even do here is we can say, well, I guess, yeah, we'd want to do it like this. And the reason why is because we're passing in the at post. So we could say, the return post is equal to this, and then we need our assertion. So we'll say expect our returned post dot user dot to be the creator. So this is sort of a case of AAA testing. Now, what's AAA testing? That is AAA, which stands for arrange, act, assert. So in that sense, we can think of this as us arranging our data, right? That is, we are assigning variables. We then need to act with these variables. Act. We're acting with our arranged variables. Or, this is sort of the setup stage. And then down here, we're asserting. Assert that our expected outcome matches our actual outcome. And this is basically all you have to do to test your helper method. You can break it down in the same way you would with, a regular unit testing scenario. You arrange your information, you act with it, you assert with it, and then hopefully you pass your test. Now, again, we're doing this a bit in the wrong order here. We have an undefined method assign post creator, which is, of course, this one here. And I probably did something wrong here. So let's go ahead. We have our, I forgot to do our include posts helper. So of course we don't have this function yet because we're not including our helper method. Seems fairly intuitive. Now we do have one other error here. Expect is not available on an example group. So what does that mean? Well, just like before, we need to say this needs an it statement. So it assigns a user to a post. And we can come in here and say end. And then we can tab this over, get rid of the space here, save this. So if you ever run into this issue where it says expect is not available, it probably means you're not inside of an it statement. But once you have your it statement, you can see here we are now down to 32 examples, 0 failures, 2 pending, which means we now have 30 tests that are passing. So in the span of this video, we've managed to get 30 tests, not all of them meaningful. Some of them have been hacked together. But we've gotten them all together, sort of. But we've gotten them all to the state that they're in right now, to have an application where if we were to change something or break something, we could reasonably expect, some stuff in the code to break. So maybe this is an alert. Maybe we say redirect to @post2, and the status is deleted. Just a whole bunch of nonsense like that. If we then run Rails RSpec, we'll see, oh, we have 2 failures. Well, that's going to do it for this part of the tutorial. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'm now going to move over to the outro video. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video on testing with RSpec. I hope this was helpful for you and that you got some value out of this video. If you did, please remember to like this video. If it didn't help you, remember to dislike it so other people don't have to watch it. I don't know about you, but when I see a bad tutorial that has a whole bunch of downvotes, I usually don't keep watching it. I go find something better. So if this video was bad, remember to downvote it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, again, there is a Discord channel. I highly recommend joining it. If something in this video doesn't work for you for whatever reason, someone in the Discord will probably be able to solve your problem much quicker than I could by replying to your comments. If you want to see more of these, we do have a couple more videos coming up. I think there's 6 videos left in this series. And then after this series is over, there will, of course, be more content on the channel. So if that's something you're interested in, consider subscribing, clicking the bell, and all that other stuff YouTubers say. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.